He sat at the rough wooden table, his fingers trembling as though they still clutched a rifle. The war was behind him, yet the clang of tin trays echoed like distant artillery. Before him sat a meal so ordinary by American standards that no one else would have paused. White bread, butter, steaming coffee, and a slice of meatloaf. Nothing grand, not even a Sunday dinner. And yet, this captured German soldier stared at it as if it were a vision. His eyes brimmed with tears. Quietly, he whispered to his comrades, "I have not tasted bread this soft since I was a child." Why would a man cry over bread? Why would someone stripped of his freedom, sitting inside the fences of a prison camp, feel a kind of relief greater than he had ever known as a soldier of Hitler's army? That paradox is at the heart of this story. Tonight, we trace the journey of how thousands of German prisoners came to believe that captivity in America was not a punishment, but a kind of salvation. The year was 1943. Across the Atlantic, America had transformed itself into an arsenal unlike anything the world had seen. Factories that once built cars now churned out tanks. Assembly lines that had produced household goods now delivered bombers and rifles. The rhythm of riveters striking steel, the hiss of welding torches, the thump of conveyor belts, all merged into the soundscape of war production. In every city, smoke rose from chimneys, the pulse of a nation determined to fight across oceans. For the Germans, the contrast was stark. In their homeland, ration books dictated daily meals, shrinking portions to potatoes, thin bread, ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley. Families lined up outside bakeries, hoping for scraps. Soldiers at the front waited for supply convoys that never arrived, opening mess tins to find thin soups, crusts hard as stone. Hunger was constant, morale brittle. Meanwhile, American farms spread endlessly across the plains, their soil turned by mechanized tractors, their silos bursting with grain. Even under rationing, the American soldiers' mess hall offered meat, vegetables, and plenty of bread. The abundance shocked prisoners the moment they were shipped across the Atlantic. What they expected was cruelty. What they found was a table filled with food. The camps themselves appeared almost surreal to the men who arrived by train, still reeling from battle and defeat. Barbed wire stretched around the perimeter, guard towers punctuated the skyline, but inside stood barracks lined in neat rows, wooden bunks, communal halls, even libraries. The smell of freshly cut lumber mingled with the dust of summer. Compared to the mud of foxholes or the ruins of bombed cities, the orderliness felt unreal. Imagine the confusion of men who had been told to fear American barbarity, who had been warned that capture meant starvation or worse. Instead, they encountered guards who handed them trays of food, Red Cross parcels, even cigarettes. At first, suspicion reigned. Could this be a trick? Was the meal poisoned? Slowly, suspicion gave way to astonishment. Letters tell the story best. A prisoner captured in North Africa and shipped to a camp in the American South wrote home that he ate more in a single day than he had during a week on campaign. His words slipped past censors, a faint beam of light reaching families still shivering under air raids. At home, they scraped together turnip stews. In America, their sons and husbands tasted butter, jam, even fruit. That first shock, the shock of food, was more than nourishment. It was a revelation. Bread became evidence. If propaganda had painted America as a nation of cruelty, what else had been lies? The slice of bread on a tin tray carried a weight far beyond its calories. Night in the camps brought another unexpected experience. Instead of gunfire, there was music. Guards allowed choirs, sometimes even orchestras, to form among the prisoners. Voices lifted into the warm air, singing Brahms or Schubert under the stars. Guards listened in silence, leaning on rifles that no longer seemed threatening. The sound carried across cotton fields and pine forests. For the men, the music was not just a memory of home, but a strange freedom, a chance to reclaim culture without the shadow of ideology looming over them. It is difficult to imagine the dissonance. At the front, the only music was the howl of shells, the crash of artillery. In captivity, violins and harmonies. For men raised on the belief that German culture was superior, it was startling to discover that their captors allowed it, even encouraged it. The paradox deepened. And then came work. Many prisoners were sent to farms, orchards, or lumberyards. They labored under the watch of a single guard, often a young American barely older than themselves. The work was honest, exhausting under the summer sun, but it carried a strange dignity. Farmers who had lost sons to the draft now relied on these former enemies to harvest wheat, pick cotton, or cut timber. Payment went to the U.S. government, but prisoners received small tokens, canteen coupons that could buy cigarettes or sweets. The sight was familiar across the American countryside. Trucks carrying Germans in dusty uniforms, working alongside local hands, sometimes even laughing despite language barriers. For the prisoners, it meant stepping beyond the fence, breathing air not filtered through wire, seeing the world as something other than an enemy's cage. The irony was bitter. Back in Europe, the German state forced laborers from conquered nations into inhuman conditions. Here in America, the German prisoners themselves were treated more humanely than many civilians had ever expected. The inversion gnawed at them. Ideology had promised one thing. Reality offered another. News crept in as well. Radios in camps carried American broadcasts. Headlines were pinned to bulletin boards. Slowly the prisoners realized the Reich was losing. Stalingrad had fallen. Allied bombers hammered German cities. Entire divisions had been destroyed. At first disbelief, then resignation. Finally collapse. "It was here we first believed," one prisoner later confessed. The statistics were undeniable. Millions of Germans were dead, millions more captured. And yet these men inside barbed wire were alive, eating, even gaining weight. Every newspaper clipping, every broadcast, every whisper chipped away at the illusion of invincibility. And through it all there were the small moments. A guard slipping an extra slice of pie on a tray. A chaplain arranging a Christmas service with candles and carols. A farmer sharing a joke through broken language. These moments mattered more than policies or rations. They proved that humanity survived even in war. The men remembered their training, the warnings of cruelty, the speeches about merciless enemies. And then they looked down at their plates, full and warm, and wondered, who had lied to them? By 1944, the paradox of captivity had settled deep into the minds of thousands of German soldiers across America. They lived behind fences, yes, but the fences became less menacing over time. Barbed wire shimmered in the sun, more a symbol than a threat. The reality inside was stability. Meals served at regular hours, beds with blankets, a routine of work and rest. Compared to the chaos of the collapsing Reich, life in captivity felt like a strange kind of order. The camps were scattered across the country, from the plains of Texas to the forests of Minnesota, from the desert edges of Arizona to the rolling farmland of the Midwest. Each site was chosen carefully, far from coasts, difficult to escape, and often near industries or farms in need of hands. Trainloads of weary men, captured in North Africa, Sicily, or France, were brought inland. They stepped off, blinking at landscapes they had never imagined. Some had grown up among the snow-capped Alps, others in smoky Ruhr cities. Now they found themselves staring at endless rows of corn, cotton fields stretching to the horizon, or pine woods buzzing with cicadas. The sounds were different too. Instead of the shriek of bombs, they heard crickets at night, trains in the distance, or church bells from nearby towns. The air smelled of cut hay, diesel, and occasionally the sweet aroma of pies cooling in farmhouses. For men who had spent months in dust and blood, these smells were almost unbearable reminders of the normal life they had lost. The U.S. military, bound by convention but also practical need, allowed prisoners to organize their own routines inside. They elected camp spokesmen, ran their own kitchens under supervision, and even set up classes. In one camp, a prisoner who had been a schoolteacher in Germany gave lectures on mathematics. In another, an engineer taught mechanical drawing. Libraries filled with donated English and German books became popular. Men studied Shakespeare, Mark Twain, Goethe, or mathematics textbooks, anything to fill the hours. This intellectual life was not a gift of luxury, it was strategy. An occupied mind was less likely to rebel. Yet the result was profound. Some prisoners admitted they learned more in captivity than they had during years of military service. Knowledge became another unexpected offering, as surprising as soft bread or cigarettes. Still, captivity was not without its shadows. Groups of die-hard loyalists, sometimes called the Black Guards, tried to police fellow prisoners, threatening or even beating those they saw as traitors to the Reich. These internal divisions created tension. Some men clung desperately to ideology, refusing to believe the news of German defeats. Others, softened by food and kindness, began to doubt everything they had once sworn to uphold. Camps sometimes erupted in secret disputes, whispered arguments in the barracks at night, fists thrown when guards were not watching. And yet, over time, the weight of reality pressed harder. Each new headline, each radio broadcast, each letter from home told of bombings, shortages, and despair. Meanwhile, in the camp cafeteria, trays clattered with abundance. The contrast grew unbearable. Loyalty to the Reich weakened not because of indoctrination from the enemy, but because lived experience told a different story. Work outside the fences deepened this transformation. In the Midwest, prisoners were trucked to vast fields, tasked with harvesting wheat under the blazing sun. Farmers, wary at first, soon discovered these young men were not monsters but simply boys, often no older than their own sons. With broken English and gestures, they worked side by side, sharing water jugs and laughter. At the end of the day, prisoners returned dusty, tired, but strangely satisfied. Some Americans, of course, remained suspicious. For families with loved ones fighting in Europe, the sight of enemy soldiers walking freely under the guard of a single rifle was unsettling. Letters poured into newspapers, demanding to know why Nazis were allowed such comfort. Yet farmers quietly appreciated the labor. Crops had to be harvested. Without these men, much would have rotted in the fields. Prisoners noticed the contradiction too. They were treated with a level of trust and responsibility that clashed with everything they had been told about American cruelty. They began to wonder, who truly valued their humanity, their own leaders who had thrown them into hopeless battles or their captors who gave them bread and work? One recurring memory among veterans of these camps was the shock of Christmas. In several places, guards arranged for trees, carols, even small gifts. Men gathered in chapels or barracks, candles flickering, voices singing hymns they had sung since childhood. Some guards joined softly, their accents clumsy but sincere. For a few hours the war seemed suspended. Many prisoners wept openly, overwhelmed by the realization that their enemies had allowed them to keep their traditions alive. It was during such moments that the full collapse of ideology became visible. Propaganda had painted Americans as heartless. Yet here they were, permitting the very rituals that bound these men to home and memory. The contradiction was too vast to ignore. The men also experienced a kind of unexpected fraternity with the guards. Young Americans, often scarcely older, would lean on rifles, chat awkwardly, share smokes. They compared farm life, spoke about families, and sometimes joked through broken German or English. What separated them was not hatred but circumstance. Both were pawns in a vast machine. The realization unsettled many. Still, captivity was no paradise. Longing for home never ceased. Letters arrived irregularly, often censored. News of bombings in Hamburg or Berlin tore through barracks like wildfire. Some men discovered their homes destroyed, families displaced. For them, the abundance of the camp became almost unbearable, a guilty comfort while their loved ones starved. Others buried their grief in work, in study, or in the routines of camp life. And yet, as the months rolled on, the refrain returned. Here at least they were alive. Here at least they were fed. Here at least they were treated with a dignity denied by their own collapsing regime. For many, It was the first time they began to see their enemy not as propaganda had painted him, but as fellow humans. The paradox sharpened with every passing season. Captivity was supposed to be humiliation. Instead, for many German soldiers, it became a strange form of salvation. By the spring of 1944, the rhythm of camp life had become familiar. The clang of the morning bell, the shuffle of boots to the mess hall, the smell of coffee and bread, these were sounds and scents that marked each day. For some men, the very predictability was disorienting. They had come from the front where every dawn might bring an artillery barrage. Now dawn brought porridge, bread, and a cigarette if one was lucky. The contrast gnawed at them in ways they could barely explain. Letters from home deepened the dissonance. Families described air raids, food shortages, the disappearance of neighbors into the draft or into bomb shelters. Mothers wrote of queuing for hours for a handful of potatoes. Brothers complained that ration coupons bought nothing. In the camps, men read these words while sipping hot coffee or spreading jam on bread. Many felt guilt, a bitter guilt that burned worse than hunger. They were safe while their families starved. The guards noticed the mood swings. One week, the prisoners laughed during soccer games in the yard. The next, silence hung heavy as news of bombings filtered in. The war outside seeped into the camp through letters and newspapers pinned to bulletin boards. Men gathered, staring at headlines, whispering interpretations. Some still clung to belief. The Führer has a secret weapon, they insisted. But as reports of defeats piled up, those voices grew weaker. It was not only news that shook them. It was the very condition of their bodies. Prisoners began to realize they were healthier than they had been as soldiers. Meals were steady, medical care available. Doctors treated wounds, pulled teeth, bandaged cuts. In one camp infirmary, a prisoner marveled at receiving medicine he had never seen available even to civilians in Germany. The irony was painful. As captives they were restored, as soldiers they had been discarded. One recurring motif across camps was the soccer ball. Guards often allowed matches in the yard, and prisoners threw themselves into the game with ferocity. The thump of the ball, the roar of makeshift crowds, the bursts of laughter, these sounds echoed through the wire. For an hour, men forgot they were captives. They were simply young men running, sweating, shouting in joy. The soccer ball became a kind of symbol, a reminder that humanity persisted even in confinement. Work assignments extended that sense of normalcy. On farms, prisoners milked cows, picked fruit, or dug irrigation ditches. The rhythm of labor in the open air eased their minds. Farmers sometimes offered small tokens. Apples slipped into pockets, glasses of cold water, even pie on rare occasions. Stories spread quickly back in the barracks, and men recounted with amazement the kindness of strangers who should have hated them. Such experiences shattered stereotypes. For years, propaganda had dehumanized Americans, calling them decadent, brutal, soulless. Yet here they were, ordinary people sharing food and laughter. Prisoners began to see the contradiction between words they had been fed and the reality they now lived. That realization was more dangerous to ideology than any weapon. There were darker undercurrents too. Within the barbed wire, not all prisoners adapted. Hardline loyalists attempted to maintain control. They accused others of weakness, of betraying the Reich, of believing enemy lies. Secret trials were held in barracks, whispered threats delivered in the night. On rare occasions, men were beaten for speaking too freely about Germany's collapse. Fear lingered. The war had ended for their bodies but not for their minds. Yet, despite the intimidation, doubt spread. Bread, music, work, soccer. Each small experience chipped away at indoctrination. The paradox could not be ignored. If America truly were as evil as described, why would guards smile, farmers joke, chaplains provide Christmas trees? Why would the enemy feed them more generously than their own government had ever done? Psychologists who later studied these camps described the effect as ideological erosion. Belief does not vanish in a single moment. It wears away under the steady drip of contradiction. A slice of pie here, a soccer game there, a radio broadcast, a farmer's laugh. Together they became a flood, dissolving certainty. For some prisoners, the transformation was startling. Men who had once marched with fanatical zeal now sat in the barracks studying English grammar, practicing phrases like, "thank you," or "good morning." Others began sketching the landscapes of Texas or Oklahoma, their notebooks filled with images of barns, tractors, and wide skies. They carried these drawings home after the war, souvenirs of a captivity that had felt strangely alive. And yet always there was the shadow of guilt. Letters continued to arrive, telling of destroyed homes, missing relatives, hunger. One prisoner confided to a friend that he dreaded mealtime because the food reminded him too painfully of his family's suffering. Another confessed that he ate with tears in his eyes, torn between gratitude and shame. The guards, though not blind to these emotions, could only offer small mercies. A kind word, a cigarette, an extra slice of bread. These gestures mattered more than they knew. For the prisoners, such acts of humanity became unforgettable. Years later, many would recall the guard who winked as he passed a piece of pie, or the chaplain who prayed with them at Christmas. These small images burned deeper than any speech or sermon. By late 1944, the tide of the war had turned decisively. News of Allied landings in France, the liberation of cities, the collapse of German armies poured into the camps. For some prisoners, the realization was crushing. They had lost not only the war but also the foundation of their beliefs. Others felt relief. At least it would end, at least their families might soon know peace. The camps became places of waiting, long months of waiting. Men stared through fences at the changing seasons, corn growing tall, leaves turning red, snow blanketing the ground. They marked time not by battles but by harvests, by the arrival of Red Cross parcels, by the rhythm of work. The world beyond seemed distant, yet its echoes never ceased. In the midst of this waiting, identity shifted. Soldiers ceased to think of themselves as soldiers. They were simply men far from home, surviving. Captivity had stripped them of uniforms, weapons, ideology. What remained was hunger for meaning, and sometimes, the surprising discovery that their enemy had given them more of it than their own leaders ever had. Winter settled hard across the camps in late 1944. Frost crusted the barbed wire, boots crunched on frozen ground, and men huddled near stoves that sputtered with coal. Inside the barracks, breath hung in the air like ghostly smoke. Yet compared to the Eastern Front, the cold was merciful. Prisoners often remarked that they had never faced a winter with such steady meals, with blankets enough to share, with roofs that did not leak snow. The paradox weighed heavily. Life as a captive in America could feel warmer than life as a soldier in Germany. One story captures this tension. A young sergeant from Bavaria sat before his first plate of pancakes in a Texas camp. Steam curled upward, butter melting into golden pools. He picked up his fork hesitantly as though suspecting a trick. When he finally took a bite, syrup dripping down his chin, he began to cry. "It tastes of home," he whispered. His companions looked on, stunned. In that moment, the thin line between enemy and guest blurred. Food, simple food, had undone the iron grip of propaganda. This was not an isolated reaction. Across camps, men encountered American meals with disbelief. Fresh vegetables, meat, milk, these were luxuries. In Germany, ration cards limited families to scraps. Civilians counted potatoes one by one. Children learned to silence hunger with thin soups. But in the mess halls of captivity, plates arrived heaped with portions unimaginable back home. The abundance was a shock to the body and the mind. The guards themselves were aware of this contradiction. Some smiled knowingly as prisoners gaped at the servings. Others shrugged, saying simply, "This is normal here." That casual phrase carried enormous weight. If abundance was normal in America, what did that say about the system the prisoners had believed in? If the enemy could feed them better than their own leaders, what had all the sacrifice been for? Letters home became more cautious. Prisoners knew censors reviewed each word, yet they sought ways to hint at their bewilderment. One wrote that he was healthy, very healthy, more than before. Another said he no longer worried about bread. Families reading between the lines realized the truth. Their sons and husbands were eating better as captives than they were as free citizens. The irony was unbearable. Camp administrators sometimes attempted to balance generosity with discipline. They feared that excessive comfort would breed complacency or resentment among local civilians struggling with rationing. But even with restrictions, the scale of American supply was staggering. Convoys delivered flour, coffee, sugar by the ton. Red Cross parcels added chocolate, cigarettes, even condensed milk. The prisoners lived in a bubble of sustenance, shielded from the hunger gnawing at Europe. And hunger was not only physical. Many prisoners discovered a hunger for conversation, for music, for normality. Camp officials encouraged cultural programs. Orchestras formed with violins, accordions, even makeshift drums. Choirs practiced hymns. The sound of German voices singing drifted over fences, mingling strangely with American bugle calls. For a few minutes, men forgot they were enemies. Education flourished too. Universities sent books. Teachers among the prisoners held classes in mathematics, history, languages. Some studied English avidly, believing it might be useful after the war. Others dove into philosophy, theology, or literature, trying to make sense of the chaos. One prisoner later recalled that captivity was his real university, a time when he learned more than ever before. Yet the most powerful lessons came not from books but from daily contradictions. Guards who shared cigarettes, farmers who offered pies, chaplains who spoke of forgiveness, each chipped away at walls of hatred. The prisoners confronted an uncomfortable question. If the enemy was capable of kindness, what did that mean for everything they had been taught to believe? The soccer ball continued to roll across muddy yards. Matches became legendary, with hundreds of prisoners cheering, bets placed on the outcome, laughter echoing across barbed wire. Americans sometimes joined in, creating surreal scenes of captors and captives chasing the same ball, shouting the same expletives, laughing at the same slips in the mud. The ball became more than a game, it was a metaphor for shared humanity. Still, not all were swayed. Hardliners policed the barracks, scrawling slogans, muttering threats. They saw the comfort of captivity as a danger, a poison that dulled loyalty. Some tried to reassert discipline with speeches, warning that Germany would rise again, that prisoners must remain faithful. But their words rang hollow against the backdrop of steaming meals and roaring laughter from soccer fields. As the war dragged on, the balance tilted. Each new defeat announced on bulletin boards eroded faith further. Stalingrad had already been a blow, but Normandy, the push through France, the bombing of German cities, each headline tore another hole in the fabric of belief. Prisoners stared at the news, silent, then returned to their bunks to ponder the unthinkable. The Reich might truly fall. It was in this atmosphere that the crying Bavarian sergeant became a symbol. Men repeated his story, sometimes mockingly, sometimes with sympathy. The pancakes made him weep, they said. But beneath the humor lay recognition. They all knew what he had felt. The shock of realizing that life as a prisoner could taste sweeter than life as a soldier. That realization haunted them, challenged them, and ultimately transformed them. The paradox of captivity, safety, nourishment, dignity, clashed with the ideology that had once defined them. They had been told to fight for glory, for empire, for destiny. Instead, they found themselves living more humanely at the hands of the enemy. That contradiction became the slow fuse leading to collapse, not of armies alone but of belief itself. By early 1945, the rhythm of life inside the camps had grown strangely stable. For the men, days blurred into one another. Meals, work, soccer, letters, sleep. Yet beneath that surface, profound shifts were taking place. Each passing month widened the gap between what they had believed and what they now lived. The war outside was reaching its deadliest phase. Cities across Germany burned under relentless bombing. Families dug through rubble for scraps of food. Civilians huddled in basements, listening to sirens, praying walls would hold. But the prisoners in America walked under open skies, worked in fields where crops thrived, sang songs around campfires. The contrast was unbearable for some, liberating for others. One prisoner, a schoolteacher in civilian life, began to keep a secret diary. He described watching American children walk to school each morning past the camp fence. "They are laughing," he wrote. "Their shoes are strong, their faces round with food. They know nothing of hunger." He compared this vision to letters from home where parents wrote of children fainting in classrooms from malnutrition. His pen trembled as he asked himself, how could the world his government described as degenerate produce such healthy children? In the work details, the contradictions grew sharper. On farms, German prisoners harvested corn alongside American farmers. The farmers sometimes shared stories of their own sons fighting overseas, even of sons killed in battle. Yet despite grief, they treated the prisoners with civility. One farmer, after a day's work, poured mugs of cold milk for the men. "You've earned it," he said simply. For the prisoners, the gesture carried more weight than any speech. They had been taught to expect hatred. Instead, they received respect. Food remained the most visceral symbol. In one camp, prisoners received Christmas dinners of turkey, potatoes, and pie. They decorated makeshift trees with scraps of paper and sang carols. Some cried openly, not only from homesickness but from the overwhelming irony. The enemy was giving them Christmas while their families endured hunger in darkened basements. The sense of guilt intensified. A corporal from the Rhineland confessed to a chaplain that he sometimes wished he could share his rations through the fence. "It feels wrong," he said, "to eat while my wife starves." The chaplain listened, offered comfort, but the paradox remained. Safety and abundance could be as heavy a burden as danger and want. Amid these contradictions, education flourished further. American authorities encouraged it, hoping to plant seeds of democracy. Classes were held in literature, politics, even constitutional law. Some prisoners debated fiercely, defending old beliefs. Others listened, curious but skeptical. But slowly, the very act of debating in safety planted doubts. They realized that in Germany, such open discussion might have led to prison, or worse. Music also carried power. In the evenings, harmonicas and guitars filled the barracks. Songs of home echoed in the night, mingling with American jazz broadcast from radios. Prisoners tapped feet, clapped hands, sometimes even tried to imitate swing rhythms. It was more than entertainment. It was a bridge across cultures. One young man later recalled that hearing jazz for the first time was like discovering a world we had been forbidden to imagine. Yet not all moments were light. Tensions simmered as loyalists confronted doubters. Whispers of betrayal circulated. On rare nights, shouts and scuffles broke out in the dark. Fear still lingered, fear of being marked as weak or disloyal. But as the war neared its end, the power of hardliners waned. Too many defeats had piled up, too much kindness had been witnessed. Faith cracked. News of the Allied advance into Germany electrified the camps. Men crowded around bulletin boards, reading names of captured towns. Some stared silently, others muttered disbelief. A few cheered quietly, not out of hatred for their homeland, but from relief that the nightmare might end. For many, surrender was no longer unthinkable. It was inevitable. With inevitability came reflection. Who had misled them? What had they fought for? Some prisoners admitted to one another that they no longer recognized the cause that had driven them into war. They had been promised glory and destiny, but they had found only mud, fear, and loss. In captivity they discovered food, music, learning, even laughter. The comparison gnawed at them like a worm in wood, slowly hollowing out old convictions. The motif of the soccer ball appeared again. In one camp, an American guard joined a match and, after scoring a goal, raised his arms in triumph. The prisoners laughed, cheering despite themselves. At that moment, lines blurred completely. Captor and captive were teammates, not enemies. The ball bounced on, carrying with it the weight of unspoken realization. Perhaps humanity mattered more than ideology. Spring brought thaw and with it hope. Trees budded, fields turned green, and prisoners sensed the war's end approaching. Conversations turned to the future. What would they find at home? Would cities still stand? Would families still live? Some dreaded return, fearing shame or ruin. Others dreamed of rebuilding, of starting anew with lessons learned in captivity. One prisoner wrote that he had entered America as an enemy, but left as a student. Another later told his children that the camp had been the first place he tasted true freedom. Not freedom of movement, but freedom of thought. These reflections did not erase the pain of war, but they marked a turning point. Captivity had reshaped them in ways they could not yet fully grasp. The paradox remained unresolved. They were prisoners, yet in many ways freer than they had ever been in uniform. They had been defeated, yet nourished. They had been taught hatred, yet encountered kindness. And as the final battles raged far away within the wire, men waited, not for glory but for an end, and for a chance to step into a world they now saw differently. As April 1945 unfolded, rumors swept through the camps like prairie wind. Whispers that Berlin was surrounded, that leaders had fled, that the Reich was collapsing. Prisoners clustered at bulletin boards, eyes scanning each headline, searching for scraps of truth. Some still muttered defiantly, "It cannot be over." But their voices were drowned by silence, by the heavy weight of inevitability. In the mess hall, the paradox reached its sharpest point. Men who had marched under banners of conquest now stood in line for food served by their conquerors. The clatter of trays, the smell of meat and bread, the warmth of coffee, these became the sounds and scents of surrender. One man later wrote to his family that the taste of defeat was sweetened by sugar and cream. He did not mean it as mockery. He meant it as confession. The day news arrived that Germany had capitulated, the camps fell into stunned quiet. No shouts, no songs, only silence. Prisoners sat on bunks, stared at walls, some burying faces in hands. For years they had been told that their nation was invincible. Now that certainty lay in ruins. And yet, outside their barracks, the sun still shone, birds still sang, guards still strolled with casual ease. Life went on, indifferent to ideology's collapse. In that silence, men began to reckon with their own journeys. Captivity had been meant as punishment, but many realized it had been a strange form of liberation. They had been freed not only from battlefields but from illusions. Bread had challenged belief. Pancakes had pierced propaganda. Soccer had revealed shared humanity. A farmhand's glass of milk had said more than 1,000 speeches. As weeks passed, a new question rose. What would happen next? Repatriation loomed. Men wondered what awaited them in a shattered homeland. Some dreaded returning, fearing hunger, fear of blame, fear of rebuilding amid rubble. Others longed desperately for the sight of home, no matter how broken. The camps buzzed with speculation, arguments, daydreams. In preparation, American authorities organized classes on democracy, civics, even practical trades. They hoped to send back men who might rebuild rather than destroy. Prisoners studied eagerly. Some saw it as a path to survive the post-war years. Others were genuinely inspired. One group painted murals in a barracks, scenes of fields, factories, and families living in peace. The images stood as a quiet declaration. They wanted life, not death. The paradox of captivity deepened further when prisoners realized that they feared leaving. As strange as it seemed, many had grown used to safety, to nourishment, to music and learning. The camp, with all its fences, had become a sanctuary. Outside lay uncertainty, hunger, ruins. Inside there was order and plenty. The thought unsettled them. Captivity felt safer than freedom. Some prisoners expressed this openly. "We are better off here," one man admitted to his bunkmate. Another joked, "If they ask who wants to stay, I'll raise both hands." Behind the humor was truth. Prison life, intended to strip dignity, had restored it. Soldiering for the Reich, meant to bring glory, had robbed it. The inversion was complete. Guard-prisoner relations reflected this transformation. Many guards, having watched the men for months or years, felt reluctant to part. They had seen enemies turn into acquaintances, sometimes even into friends. Farewell photos were taken, gifts exchanged. A carved wooden toy, a sketch of a farm, a signed postcard. These mementos carried forward, tangible proof of a strange bond born of war. For prisoners, the memory of first meals remained indelible. They spoke often of that moment, the first bite of bread, the first sip of coffee, the first taste of pie. These were not simply meals. They were revelations, cracks in the wall of belief. Each flavor told them something their leaders never had, that the world was not as they had been taught to fear. The crying sergeant's story lived on in camp lore. By now, men told it almost fondly. Remember him with the pancakes? Some laughed, others nodded with respect. That single tear over syrup had become a parable, retold again and again, how a soldier discovered humanity in defeat. In its simplicity lay its power. The paradox carried through to repatriation itself. As men boarded trains and ships to return to Europe, they carried more than belongings. They carried questions. Why had their nation starved while the enemy fed them? Why had their government promised greatness but delivered ruin? And why had they found dignity not in victory but in captivity? Some buried these questions deep, ashamed to voice them in ruined towns. Others spoke openly, shocking neighbors with stories of abundance in America. And some quietly began to build new lives shaped by lessons learned behind barbed wire. They became teachers, farmers, fathers who told their children not of glory in war, but of pancakes in captivity. The legacy of those camps lived long after the fences fell. Men who had once marched in lockstep later recalled the clatter of trays, the laughter of soccer, the taste of pie. They remembered not only being defeated but being humanized. And in that memory lay the enduring paradox. They had been prisoners, yet in many ways they had never been freer. Ships began to fill with prisoners bound for Europe in the summer of 1945. The war was over, victory declared, and now the long process of return began. On the docks, men carried bundles of belongings, carved wooden toys, drawings of farms, notebooks filled with English words, and the most precious of all, letters from families they had not seen in years. The air smelled of salt and coal smoke. For many, the excitement of going home was mingled with dread. The voyage itself was quiet, almost solemn. Men lined the rails, staring across the ocean, wondering what awaited them on the other shore. Some tried to cheer themselves with songs or card games, but most sat in silence, lost in thought. They had lived in abundance, now they sailed toward scarcity. They had known safety, now they faced ruins. The paradox pressed on them with every wave. When they disembarked in Europe, reality struck like a blow. Cities lay flattened, rail lines twisted, bridges collapsed. Families met them with hollow eyes and gaunt faces. Children clung shyly to fathers who looked healthier than their mothers. The prisoners realized, almost with shame, that they had gained weight in captivity while their families had wasted away in hunger. One former soldier described walking through his hometown and feeling like a stranger. "I came back strong, my belly full," he later recalled. "The people looked at me as if I had stolen something from them." In truth, the abundance of captivity had become a burden of guilt. Yet among the rubble, stories of captivity spread. Some men told neighbors about plentiful meals, about music and education in the camps. Others stayed silent, fearing envy or anger. But word traveled. People whispered, "Our sons ate better in America than we did at home." The irony stung deeply. For many ex-prisoners, the greatest struggle was reconciling belief with experience. They had marched to war under slogans of superiority. But captivity had shown them weakness, and kindness from the very enemy they had been told to despise. Some buried the contradiction, retreating into silence. Others embraced it, speaking of lessons learned. A few even returned to America years later, drawn back by memories of unexpected humanity. Among veterans groups, the stories were debated fiercely. Was captivity truly better than soldiering? Some rejected the notion as dishonorable. Others insisted it was undeniable. The debates reflected larger struggles in post-war society: how to explain defeat, how to rebuild identity, how to move forward without repeating the past. Education played a crucial role. Those who had studied in the camps brought back new skills. Some became teachers, engineers, or writers. They carried not just knowledge of subjects but also of methods: open discussion, critical thinking, the willingness to question. These subtle seeds took root, contributing quietly to a generation that would reshape Europe. Even simple cultural influences lingered. Men who had tasted jazz in American camps sought out records after the war. Others remembered baseball games or Hollywood films shown in the barracks. These fragments of culture, carried home by former enemies, became bridges across the Atlantic. They did not erase scars of war, but they complicated them, adding layers of memory beyond hatred. The crying sergeant's story followed them too. In letters, in memoirs, in quiet conversations, men recalled the moment he wept over pancakes. It became a symbol of disillusionment, of awakening, of the strange power of ordinary kindness. Years later, when asked about the war, some men did not speak of battles or medals. They spoke of that breakfast. Not all memories were sweet. Some carried shame for the way loyalists had bullied doubters inside the camps. Others carried guilt for surviving while comrades had died on the front. And many carried the heavy weight of knowing they had fought for a cause that collapsed not only militarily but morally. Captivity had forced them to face that truth in ways the battlefield never had. The paradox, once lived, could not be forgotten. They had been prisoners yet cared for. Enemies yet fed. Defeated yet educated. Each contradiction left a mark. Some marks faded into silence. Others guided choices for the rest of their lives. A few became outspoken advocates for reconciliation, using their own stories as bridges between former foes. Years passed and the memory of captivity shifted. For some, it remained a shameful chapter. To have been a prisoner was to have failed. For others, it became a defining transformation, the point where they learned the fragility of ideology and the strength of humanity. Both truths coexisted side by side in the memory of thousands. And always, beneath the memories, lingered the taste of that first American meal: warm bread, hot coffee, butter melting on pancakes. It was a taste of defeat, but also of awakening. For many, it was the moment they realized that the world was larger, kinder, and more complicated than they had been taught to believe. By the late 1940s, the story of captivity began to take on a life of its own. Former prisoners, scattered across towns and villages, carried memories that shaped not just personal lives but public conversations. Some spoke openly, others guarded their experiences like fragile secrets. But whether whispered or written, the paradox of their imprisonment seeped into collective memory. Memoirs appeared, often modestly printed, sometimes only for family. In them, men described camp routines, meals, soccer games, classes, and above all, the shock of kindness from the enemy. Critics in their homelands often dismissed these accounts as exaggerations or even betrayal. Yet the stories persisted, carried by truth's quiet resilience. Wives and mothers who had starved through the winters of war often reacted with bitterness. One woman snapped at her returning husband, "You ate cake while we dug through garbage?" The gulf between their suffering and his survival was hard to bridge. Captivity had divided not just nations but families. And yet, over time, even resentment gave way to a kind of grim acceptance. Men who had been prisoners found ways to use their experience. They built gardens like those they had tended in American camps. They taught children baseball or sang fragments of American songs. What had once been humiliation became a strange kind of resource. In villages still scarred by bomb craters, neighbors gathered around to listen to tales of abundance. At first, disbelief. then fascination. Some even laughed at the absurdity. So you mean they gave you second helpings? Humor softened envy. Slowly, the idea took hold that maybe the world across the ocean was not only powerful but also generous. Cultural echoes began to surface. A carpenter, once a camp artist, now painted murals in town halls with bright colors reminiscent of barracks walls. A farmer planted corn and beans together, copying methods seen on Midwestern farms. Children grew up with fathers who told bedtime stories not of battles but of baseball games played behind fences. The paradox was reshaping life in small, almost invisible ways. But silence persisted too. In public, many men avoided speaking of captivity. They feared being labeled cowards or collaborators. Some carried their stories privately until old age, when they finally told grandchildren what had happened. By then, memories had softened, turning from shame to wisdom. The paradox of captivity found its way into art and literature. Novels hinted at it, poems described it obliquely, films alluded to it in fragments. The image of a soldier eating pancakes while crying recurred like a motif, a shorthand for the collapse of belief. Each retelling carried its own weight, its own interpretation. In political debates, the memory of how prisoners were treated played a subtle role. When new alliances were forged across the Atlantic, skeptics could not deny the testimony of thousands who had lived under American guards. Their stories became quiet arguments for reconciliation. Politicians rarely said it aloud, but the experience of captivity softened old hostilities. For the men themselves, the years after return were often restless. Many could not settle easily into ordinary routines. Some sought out fellow ex-prisoners, forming clubs and associations where they could share memories without judgment. They published newsletters, exchanged photographs, held reunions. In these gatherings, laughter often returned. Jokes about mess hall food, about clumsy baseball swings, about the first time someone tried peanut butter. But always, beneath the laughter, ran a current of seriousness. They knew their experience was unusual, perhaps unique in the long, brutal history of war. To have been treated not with cruelty but with care, it marked them, separated them from millions of others whose fates had been far darker. Survivors' guilt mingled with gratitude. Some tried to give back. A few became teachers who emphasized tolerance. Others joined civic groups promoting reconciliation. A handful emigrated, returning to America permanently, drawn back by the memory of its abundance. They built lives in the very country that had once been their captor, living proof of paradox made flesh. In their old age, many reflected on how captivity had changed them more than battle ever did. Combat had been noise, chaos, fear. Captivity had been slow, reflective, quietly transformative. One man summarized it simply, "I went to war believing lies. I came home believing bread." That sentence captured the heart of their experience better than volumes of analysis. And so, as Europe rebuilt, the legacy of captivity lived quietly in kitchens and classrooms, in conversations and choices. It did not erase trauma, nor did it glorify defeat. But it added texture, complication, humanity. It reminded those who lived through it, and their descendants, that even in the darkest conflicts, moments of unexpected kindness could leave marks deeper than hatred. By the 1950s, the memory of captivity had settled into a kind of quiet undercurrent in European society. Official histories often glossed over it, focusing instead on battles, strategies, and the rise and fall of nations. But within families, the paradox of those years behind barbed wire still shaped lives. Grandchildren grew up with fragments of stories. A grandfather might casually mention that he first tasted ice cream in a prison camp, or that he learned a little English while peeling potatoes for guards. These odd details puzzled children. They seemed to contradict the grim picture painted in schoolbooks. The war, they were told, was horror and destruction. Yet here was their own relative remembering kindness, even laughter. In that contradiction lay a deeper truth. Captivity had forced soldiers to confront not only the brutality of their own regime but also the unexpected humanity of their enemy. It was a lesson that could not easily be taught in classrooms but was passed down in quiet anecdotes at dinner tables during long walks. Some of these men lived double lives. In public they wore medals, spoke of duty, kept up the image of soldiers. In private, they admitted that the days of regular meals and relative safety behind American fences had been, in some strange way, easier than the front lines. This duality troubled them, but it also enriched their understanding of war and peace. Writers and journalists eventually took notice. Articles appeared in small magazines, hinting at the unusual experiences of former prisoners. Later, books explored the subject more fully, though often with controversy. Nationalists accused authors of exaggerating, of trying to whitewash defeat. Yet readers responded with fascination. They sensed that the paradox of captivity revealed something essential about human nature. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Americans who had guarded the camps carried their own memories. Many had been young men from farms or small towns, suddenly tasked with overseeing hundreds of enemy soldiers. At first they felt suspicion, even fear. But as weeks passed, they saw the prisoners not as faceless foes but as weary men, hungry and far from home. Guards, too, recalled the paradox, that war demanded enmity, but daily contact bred familiarity. Letters from guards mentioned teaching prisoners songs, or swapping stories about harvests in hometowns. Some described prisoners crying when served generous meals, and how that moment shook their own assumptions about the enemy. For these American veterans, the experience remained one of the most striking memories of their service. Not the battlefields but the human encounters behind fences. The legacy of these encounters stretched far. In later decades, when transatlantic partnerships were forged, the memory of humane captivity smoothed the path. Former prisoners who later became politicians, businessmen, or teachers carried their impressions of America into their work. They were living witnesses that the enemy had once shown compassion. Cultural exchange programs in the 1960s sometimes included former prisoners who revisited the United States, this time as free men. Photographs from those trips show middle-aged Europeans shaking hands with former guards, laughing over meals, pointing out landmarks. What had once been a relationship of captor and captive transformed into friendship. For families of these men, the paradox remained deeply personal. Children heard stories of barbed wire but also of baseball games, of boredom but also of learning. They struggled to reconcile the image of war as unrelenting suffering with the more complicated reality their fathers described. Some even pursued studies in history or international relations, driven by the desire to understand how such contradictions could exist. And yet, silence still blanketed much of the past. Many men never spoke in detail about their captivity. They carried the memories inside, perhaps fearing that others would not understand. Some felt guilt for having survived relatively well while comrades had perished elsewhere. Others feared that their families, who had suffered at home, would resent their stories of abundance. Silence became its own kind of inheritance. Still, whenever a memory slipped out, a taste, a song, a fragment of English spoken with an accent, it carried the weight of paradox. Children and grandchildren sensed the complexity. War was not simply black and white, victory and defeat. It was also hunger and bread, hatred and kindness, fear and laughter, all tangled together. As decades passed, historians began to see captivity not just as a footnote but as a vital part of the wartime story. They recognized that how a nation treated its prisoners said much about its values, its resources, and its vision of the future. In that sense, the story of men crying over their first American meal was not trivial, but central. It revealed the power of food, shelter, and decency to shatter illusions built on propaganda. The paradox of captivity became a lens for understanding broader truths. It showed that wars are fought not only with weapons but also with ideas, and that sometimes, the most powerful blow to an ideology comes not from a bullet but from a plate of warm bread. As the century moved forward, the men who had once stood behind barbed wire aged into grandfathers and great-grandfathers. Their memories, once sharp and raw, softened with time. Yet certain images never faded. The clang of the mess hall tray, the taste of cornbread, the bewilderment of being treated with dignity by an enemy they had been taught to fear. Some shared these stories in schools, invited to speak about the war. Students often expected tales of combat, of guns and victories. Instead, they heard about tears shed over the first meal in captivity, about baseball games played under watchtowers, about discovering that the enemy's world was not only different but, in many ways, enviable. The students were startled, but they listened. In those classrooms, the paradox continued its work. Young people, far removed from the war, began to see history not as a simple contest of good and evil but as a tapestry of human choices, fears, and surprising kindness. The story of the prisoner who cried over bread became a parable about the fragility of belief and the resilience of humanity. By the late 20th century, reunions between former prisoners and guards became more common. Old men clasped hands, their uniforms long since put away, their memories now shared rather than opposed. Photographs captured smiles lined with age, eyes misting with recognition. What had once been unthinkable, friendship between former enemies, became not only possible but real. For the prisoners, the paradox had been life-changing. Many admitted that captivity gave them their first glimpse of a world beyond propaganda. They had been raised on tales of superiority, of inevitable victory. Captivity shattered those illusions. In their place, it planted seeds of humility, of curiosity, even of admiration for the enemy's society. These seeds sprouted in unexpected ways, in careers chosen, in political attitudes, in the values passed to children. The legacy also touched the guards. Some recalled that the experience of treating prisoners humanely shaped their own understanding of duty. They realized that strength did not always mean cruelty, that victory could also be measured by decency. Decades later, when they spoke to grandchildren about the war, they often emphasized not battles but the importance of treating others as human beings. As archives opened and historians dug deeper, the testimonies of both sides confirmed the paradox. Captivity, instead of crushing spirits, had sometimes preserved them. Soldiers discovered safety in an enemy camp that they had not known in their own army. Bread, butter, and kindness proved more powerful than slogans and orders. The broader implications were profound. If war could produce such contradictions, what did that mean for peace? If a nation could win loyalty not by force but by fairness, then perhaps the future could be built less on domination and more on understanding. Politicians and thinkers, whether consciously or not, drew on these lessons as they sought reconciliation after decades of conflict. In the end, the story of the crying prisoner is not just about one man or one meal. It is about the collapse of illusions when confronted with reality. It is about the power of small gestures, a full plate, a second helping, a kind word, to undermine hatred more effectively than any weapon. And it is about how ordinary people, caught in extraordinary times, can carry unexpected lessons across generations. Today, when we look back on those years, we see more than uniforms and flags. We see men who walked into captivity with fear and left with new perspectives. We see guards who discovered that humanity could survive even amid the machinery of war. And we see how, in the quiet spaces between battles, history was shaped not only by generals and politicians but by meals shared across barbed wire. The paradox of captivity reminds us that history is never simple. It resists neat categories of villain and hero. It forces us to confront complexity, to acknowledge that even in war, compassion can appear in unlikely places. For those who lived it, the memory endured long after the guns fell silent. So as we close this story, imagine again that moment. A soldier, worn down by years of hunger and fear, sitting in a mess hall thousands of miles from home. A tray slides before him, bread, butter, perhaps even a slice of pie. He lifts the fork, takes a bite, and tears come unbidden. Not because the food is extraordinary, but because it represents a truth he had never been allowed to believe. That life could be more than scarcity, that enemies could be human, that dignity could survive war. That single moment, repeated in countless camps, changed lives. It changed families. It shaped societies. And it continues to echo through history, a reminder that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with battles, but with bread.